Blessed love and peace. We share a consideration at this moment. All these nighttime joints, it's actually, well, wow, battery's low. Low, low. Now we're not doing that one. Battery's low. We got a little bit of energy, or a little bit of storage. It's early. It's early evening, kind of sort of mid-evening, 9 p.m. Local time. It's 22 in general time. So it's about time to go to sleep. We're sharing this joint for the moment. On wrestling with demons. What we talking about with that? What's all this demon stuff and devil and all this other stuff? Habida. It's understanding where things are, what things are at this moment, beyond the things that are being packaged or presented, beyond the nations, beyond the ethnicities, beyond even the religiosities. It's understanding phenomena, even beyond science and technology. It's a further struggle, to be honest, further wrestling. It's a further toil that occurs, that takes place, that manifests through all these different things: religiosity, ethnicity, nation, science, technology, warfare, and all these other things. And demon is just one way of describing it in the English parlance, in a comparatively Judeo-Christian kind of vernacular. But we can talk about the Asuras and Devas. We can talk about the Yaksha, the Yaka fiends. We can talk about Valhalla. We can talk about the celestial that is communicated through the wisdom of Kemet and Ma'at and further. So the native tradition, native heritage, all of it speaks of this experience of the esoteric, heavenly, the otherworldly, the dreamy. And how it influences, how it relates to, how it interacts with, how it guides, how it terrorizes, how it inspires, how it strengthens, how it encourages, how it teaches, how it misleads, how it tempts the earthly experience, earthly beings. So, as I mentioned before, science has a very strong difficulty in dealing and even acknowledging this phenomenon of the esoteric, because it challenges the power position, the influence of science. If there's things that science can't explain, if there's a strength of their powers that science can't explain, that undermines the authority, the trust, the capital, the cachet, the wielding of science. So instead it says, oh, it's crazy. You can't prove that. Let's see that. And I mean, that's been going on from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and further. Even the Buddha, oh, perform miracles. It was like, it's not about miracles. It's about discipline and balance. So, at this moment, just to put things in perspective, and particularly to cultivate some patience and understanding in dealing with the challenges of this exact moment in each moment, rather than just like taking it personal and just like, oh, these kinfolk are just out to da 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 da. Understand that when cats is tripping, cats is wrestling. Facts. Um, and it doesn't make it okay. It doesn't mean we don't stand up and say, yo, you tripping right now, brethren, sister, uncle, auntie, niecey, nephew, and further. But when we do, we have some patience and some pause, proper pause, um, and recognize that that person is a minority at that moment, a minority of that person's own self. So again, I'm going to give this example as I frequently do in terms of like recognizing like what it is in terms of wrestling with demons. Again, going back to somebody being drunk. That's a plain, very common experience. Either if somebody's done it themselves, been drunk and been a fool, been drunk and just been knocked out or whatever, but just was not themselves, blacked out, doesn't remember, acting a fool, whatever, acting angry drunk, mad drunk, happy drunk, or whatever. That person is not their usual self. That is one of the easiest ways of describing that experience of being under the influence of demons. And that might sound like very strong language, but under just articulating with some different parlances like this. Being under the influence of some phenomenon, some kind of phenomenon beyond oneself, beyond another particular being. People can take advantage, and people do take advantage, getting women drunk, and additionally, just weakening a woman, weakening a man, and otherwise, signing papers and otherwise. But understanding that when a person is in that realm, in that zone, there's something that's like making that person, their person is like a puppet, and some entities just make that person just look stupid or look angry or whatever else, or look loud or belligerent or strong and superpowered or whatever else. There's something else that's making that person be that way. And so one way of describing it is just demon. We can say, people say, you got the spirits got a hold of them. That's the old English American slang from 100 years ago to this day. That's what liquor is, the spirits, and otherwise. So that's just like a go-to reference. Again, I talk about, I don't even, my experience of I don't have any experience of doing it myself to my knowledge. However, I do see the clips on social media, whatever, of like some kind of new drug thing in recent years where people are just on the street, like just almost catatonic, but just like out and kind of like fidgety like that. And are on public trails, public rail, metro, subways, and stuff like that, just being seats, like just being out of it. Demon, and under the influence, something. Those are some examples. I'll give the scientific kind of description of it is it being a chemical reaction that affects the sentience, that affects the cognitive functionality and otherwise. So rather than attributing it to some kind of esoteric otherworldly experience, it's described as a chemical imbalance, and that causes an adverse reaction within the nervous system that manifests itself in these debilitated behavioral symptoms. And so it's like, oh, okay, it's just chemistry. That's it, just chemicals. And so adjust the chemical composition, and then behavioral, the sentient experience changes, cognitive capabilities change, behavior changes. That's the general kind of psychiatric kind of description. of these phenomena, whether it's getting drunk, whether it's doing the drugs, whether it's a biologically induced experience of chemical imbalance or otherwise. That's basically how science describes it. Now, that is an extremely recent interpretation of these phenomena, just in the past 100 years of world civilization. Even the whole notion of chemistry itself, apothecaries, in addition, is an extremely, I mean, there's always been working medicines and stuff like that, but in terms of apothecaries having some kind of authority, is extremely new in world civilization. And so it's a matter of recognizing that. Now, even in taking that interpretation on its face value, even then, there's the necessity. So where the chemicals come from, and what precipitates this chemical migrations and imbalances and otherwise, and that's one of the challenges and one of the fallacies, the intrinsic fallacies and Achilles heels of science, is because science doesn't have that answer. Science goes back to the Big Bang or whatever are the recent theses concerning creation, the beginning of the universe, and science. This is not a thing about science, but science does the dazzle thing of like, well, it was millions of years ago, and there was the ice ages and this, that, and the other, and evolution and this, but it still doesn't explain it. It just like puts a lot of obstacles as a way of evading that question, because again, science does not have that answer. The answer exists beyond evidence, and to rely upon that affirmation of something beyond evidence undermines the power structures of science at this moment, and then gives further, opens the door towards looking at other explanations, from traditional, ancient, to new age, heretical, and otherwise. Because once you don't need proof as the absolute definitive measure, earthly proof through evidence of the senses, then how do you discern what to give credence to? So that's one of the challenges of the science. So going back to the chemical imbalance, and going back to the wrestling, again, the alcohol, the drugs, those are some examples. People talk about addiction, and even like AA, again, for 100 years, dealing with that thing and describing it again as being possessed and otherwise. Under the influence, that what is that phenomena of addiction, and nowadays, like, addiction is utilized in so many different ways beyond just alcohol or chemistry per se. Addicted to sex, addicted to buying clothes, addicted to lying, addicted to all the different types of stuff. So I have to be mindful of that, because a lot of the explanations of today, whether it's mental illness, whether it's psychiatric diagnoses, whether it's addiction and other types of self-harming behavior, or behavior that is detrimental to others, not necessarily physically injurious, but like manipulating others. And additionally, there's this trope of, if not addicted or whatever, there are all these tropes that endeavor to dissuade guilt. It's not that person's fault. That person has a chemical imbalance. That person was born with this affliction. That person is under the influence of their addiction. And so there's all these things about avoiding that notion of, or that accusation or condemnation of guilt, and escaping the responsibility and otherwise. And there's understanding why there's such a strong protocol and like a strong need even for those tropes of avoiding guilt and not assigning guilt on others, particularly when oneself is enveloped in doing things that are harmful to oneself or to others. And a big reason why that is, particularly within Western civilization, is because of Judeo Christian guilt, Catholic guilt, and additionally, original sin just by living, just by existing, sinner. And then once being labeled a sinner, have to be either enslaved, like just accept enslavement to somebody else's judgment, a religious authority's judgment, and just bow down to that religious authority in order to have some kind of acceptance within society, and like get food and be welcome indoors during the winter or whatever, or be shunned and excommunicated and kicked out, vilified and called enemy and called evil, and like don't talk to that person because that person is a sinner, has not repented, does not accept this, that, and the other, does not acknowledge the authority of um, the leaders of today, and so out. It's been a very extremely severe, nasty atrocity and abuses for many generations, for hundreds of years, such that when people get some geographic distance from that, United States, um, and are able to maintain some of a livelihood, people aren't trying to hear guilt or aren't trying to be blamed for things. Thus, science develops these rationales of, oh, it's not his fault, it's not her fault, it's their addiction. Their addiction is taking over. It's a chemical imbalance. It's not their fault that they're acting this way. Don't blame them. Don't be mad at them. Don't hate them. Um, just understand they're a helpless victim of that imbalance, and it's nothing they did. It's just they were born that way. It becomes another type of excommunication and condemnation, but it's a passive aggressive subordination that is similarly, to be honest, totalitarian. However, that's just the newer version of it. Um, so addiction is somewhat of it's somewhat of a later, or excuse me, an older technology, an older cognitive technology when describing these phenomena, because the newer technology, the newer social or cognitive technology is chemical imbalance in terms of mental illness. So addiction is still utilized. It's still rather commonly referred to. However, it's a little bit of the older social technology or cognitive technology. But addressing that notion of addiction, another way to recognize it is attachment, even a dependence, a psychological dependence on something. And that applies to, again, alcohol, drugs, a psychological detachment. Somebody looks for escapism, finding a refuge from just the stress and the anxiety, the fear, the creeping negative thoughts and influences, needs an escape from that. And so takes a glass of wine, takes a shot of whiskey or whatever, and things are lighter now. Yo, da 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 da, and then establishes an attachment to that methodology, and in that attachment becomes further dependent upon it in order to experience that escapism. And the nature of it is such that that first hit is the nicest, and after that it gets less and less and less, so it needs further and further and further. And whiskey can be expensive, wine can be expensive, malt liquor 40s can be expensive, and then people do things in order to get their fix. So instead of it being an addiction, and addiction basically talks to something about somebody having a perceived need beyond their personal control, beyond their own volition, that they do things to feed that addiction, because it's beyond their ability to control themselves. So that's kind of like a significant factor and characteristic of the addiction. But if we just look at it further as an attachment to something, and degrees of severity of how strong that attachment is to becoming like a need or a perceived need or dependency. Let's put it as dependency, a dependency upon that attachment. Then we can start to look at other solutions um, that are healthier and further, rather than, because the addiction has such a charged kind of like handcuffs, iron iron shackles that like again cognitive that you have a difficulty of being removed. So when we describe it as an attachment to something, then there's less of that finality and permanence or perceived permanence. Um, so, and also we can recognize that same phenomenon existing through other things that people tend to apply less towards in terms of being addicted. So, apply it towards alcohol, drugs, heroin, cocaine, crack, or other types of drugs, even cannabis, marijuana, tobacco. Um, but then also, some people talk about being addicted to clothes or addicted to food, having a food disorder. It's difficult to say being addicted to food. Everybody needs food. Does that mean everybody's addicted to food? And then you say, well, but it's addicted to overeating. But wait a minute, what is that? I mean, you don't need alcohol, so that's one thing. But food, and that's my challenge. Food, what is one of my challenge? Addicted to sex. What does that mean? So, like that word addiction is just like it's somewhat incongruent when applied on all these different ways. And so when we say attached to these different experiences, particularly as a refuge, as an escapism, then we say, okay, it's attached as a general kind of gist to it. So, okay, attached. And then depending upon the nature of that attachment, can be increasingly dependent on that attachment. And that evidence of the dependence is how frequently it's done, particularly when it's unnecessary, how much one expends of oneself, whether it's money, whether it's energy and time, whether it's harming others. All of those are evidence of how dependent somebody is on that attachment. And so when we utilize that kind of frame of reference and evaluation, then we can look at the conditions of the experience, and again, find healthier methodologies for answering those needs, those strivings. So to name some of those other type of attachments, aside from just alcohol and drugs, like I said, food, sex, money, even just making money. Just continually stack money. There's a very strong psychological attachment to just stacking money, for the sake of stacking money, and all whatever solace somebody experiences in like stacking money, whether it's Pookie or Mookie, do the right thing, like building up his stack, they're slinging pizzas, or whether it's a Wall Street trader, like building bank, literally. That is an attachment, and that can be rather dependent and in very unhealthy ways, harmful ways. So conspicuous consumption, buying things, buying clothing, and experiencing the escapism and refuge through that conspicuous consumption. So all of these are different types of attachments. Again, some people can refer to these as different types of addictions as well, but attachments. And the point with all of this that I'm describing at the moment is to recognize that in each of these cases that we describe it as an addiction, or that we describe it as an attachment, and even describe it as an attachment with significant dependence, to recognize how each of these phenomena, whether it's the drugs, whether it's the expensive clothing, or the unhealthy food, or the excessive food, whatever, each of these phenomena have an influence over that person. an influence that has adverse effects for that person. And so what we are describing is another way of articulating this, another name, another term, another translation for this, other than addiction, other than chemical imbalance, and even like from the notion of attachment or amidst the notion of attachment, is again being under the influence of malevolence. We can describe it as that, the demonic temptation. Again, all these there are a lot of different words that are utilized to describe devil, that are helpful to understand the phenomena. So I'm speaking a little bit around here and there, but again, there seems to be a proficient amount of coherence to this point. So continuing and talking about the characteristics of devil, demon, again in a very logical way, perhaps somewhat scientific in a stretched kind of version of that. There's a consideration of just recognizing a basic phenomena within the universe, which is malevolence. A phenomena that endeavors the imposition of harm upon life. And that malevolence can have, or we can observe within that malevolence, that basic phenomena, numerous specific characteristics, that include greed, hatred, delusion, jealousy. I mean, all those things like the seven deadly sins and the five hindrances, sloth, torpor, all those things that are taught within Christian doctrine, that are taught within Buddhist doctrine, and taught within other doctrine as well. We can attribute all those as characteristics of that phenomena of malevolence that has an adverse effect on people, on life. So not falling asleep yet. All right. Talking about the malevolence. It's a phenomenon. That's one thing. And for some that might be too much of a stretch, might be too comfortable, too abstract or intangible, but one who can recognize, yeah, I know there's that. And yeah, it doesn't have a specific look or a specific smell. Smelling burnt microwave popcorn right now, that's another story. Contemporary euphemism is don't ask. Anyways, you can ask, but it's another topic. Talking about the malevolence, the different characteristics. So it's one thing just to recognize that there is something like that. It's another step. It's a further step into the abstract, into that realm of reasoning, to suggest that this malevolence has some type of intentional sentience, that this phenomenon of greed actually endeavors to infest itself within earthly life, within this temporal realm, within this earthly universe. That's a considerable step, just from saying that there is such thing as temptation, but to say there's a tempter, that can be somewhat of a stretch for many people. But we do say that, and it's not a matter of the notion of it's not a significant thing of identifying or accusing a specific singular entity as the epitome or the authority or the author of temptation, but to understand that there is some that whatever that phenomena of malevolence is, that it has some element of sentience to it, to have that tendency, that effect of influencing other sentience. It's like a sea anemone. Most people consider a sea anemone like a plant without a brain or perhaps a nervous system specifically, and yet it has these tentacles that attract fish, colorful, and when the fish arrive, then the tentacles arrive and paralyze the fish and consume the fish. And some might posit that, well, that plant is actually not, doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have sentience. That's just its own biology and chemistry responding to what it perceives as the source of its nutrients, nutrition. And so it doesn't actually act and do that intentionally. It's just the chemistry, a biology connected with the chemistry, facilitating the movement of these cells. And additionally, the fish has sentience, and the fish is looking for food, but many might say, but the plant, nah, come on. So in a similar way, we can look at, again, temptation and say, okay, yeah, there's temptation, but there's not a tempter. There's not like some da-da-da-da. That's fine. It's not a big deal in our estimation about that notion of there being a single tempter or whatever else. That's not the big point. The point is understanding how temptation influences kinfolk. And it can be easier for kinfolk just to perceive there being a tempter, so that there's a further tangibility to observe and recognize and evidence the phenomena itself, and to then establish measures to minimize and avoid the adversities of that experience. I do recognize I'm starting to go off a little bit from the focal point. We were talking about demons, and talking about wrestling. So, I guess to bring this to that point, the strand or the thread that I've been sharing at the moment, to get back to that point of demons and wrestling. All these addictions, all these chemical imbalances, all these attachments, all these dependencies upon things that cause harm, amidst wherever it comes from, whether we call it addiction, whether we call it chemical imbalance, whether we call it attachment, the people who are experiencing that, whatever it is, buying clothes, shooting heroin, or whatever else, the people who are experiencing that are wrestling. The kinfolk are wrestling with those influences, with those adverse influences. And it can be extremely difficult when somebody's overeating, buying snack food from the corner store after sundown, for whatever reason, comfort, pseudo social life, nostalgia, or otherwise. It's wrestling. And that wrestling today is occurring in many, many different ways. All right, I'm trying to remember the point I'm getting to in this respect about wrestling with the demons. the basic. I'm trying to think of what was the purpose of like initiating this. That's different from what we've shared before. People are wrestling. There was something specific. I was watching some native heritage drumming that precipitated me recording this, and I'm trying to remember there's something specific to include here. I'll go back to something I referred to at the beginning of this joint. Everyone is wrestling. Everyone is wrestling with each one's own respective negative influences, whatever that may be. Regardless of what it may be, everyone is wrestling with that. Oh, okay, I remember something I was going to say. It's pervasive, and knowing about that, recognizing that, is greater than the divides between peoples, because that wrestling exists, is tenacious within each divide. And in the genuine healing and endurance and perseverance, the Gambaro within each divide requires people, requires kinfolk to recognize that that wrestling is occurring within each one's own fold. When people pretend that it doesn't exist, oh no, we're fine over here. You know, it's not perfect, but you know, we don't have any of that other stuff. When people are on that type of tip, people become further lost. It requires honesty of calling things out, of calling the wrestling out. And particularly when kinfolk are showing evidence of dwindling in that wrestling. It requires stepping up and be like, yo, what's going on? Let's work something out. As much as we can. Kinfolk have to do kinfolk's own wrestling. That's facts. But we can help. We can provide attention. We can provide, draw attention, and provide positive example and support. But there's all different types of wrestling. As I mentioned, from drugs, alcohol, to buying clothing, eating disorders, sexual addiction and manipulation, running game, and getting enveloped in those entanglements. All different types of wrestling. Attachments, dependencies, aversions, adverse experiences in a relationship, or adverse attachments. And that can be understood as wrestling with demons. When somebody's eating that cake, that person is wrestling with demons. Those demons intending that malevolence, intending physical harm within that person, eating up that sugar, susceptibility of diabetes, susceptibility of sugar affect the kidney, maybe, whatever the sugar does to the body system, or if it's salt, whatever salt does, or if it's oil, whatever oil does. The malevolence is endeavoring that harm, and the person is, the mouse has arrived. That person is wrestling with the demons to optimize that person's health and well-being. And it's beneficial for kinfolk, loved ones, to observe that in order to help promote and optimize that person's well-being in that person's wrestling. So those are some examples: alcohol, drugs, food, sex, clothing, buying things. All of these are influence. All of these are wrestling. All of these are wrestling with demons. The evidence of all these different wrestlings is rife throughout society. Even if kinfolk don't want to acknowledge there being a malevolence, an esoteric, non-evidenceable phenomena that is influencing people, kinfolk can at the very least witness the adverse attachments that people have, that people maintain, that people practice. And it's helpful for us to call some of this out when we see it, and particularly when we see it being ignored and overlooked or dismissed and otherwise. And this is what I'm getting to particularly, because this is something that I observe and that occurs to me. I'm going to call this out, and the purpose for me calling this out is not to condemn it. It's not to ridicule this, but just to call attention to the basic actuality of what it is. And what I'm talking about is tattoos and self-demarcation. Recognizing this as evidence of somebody under the influence of demons. I'm not saying tattoos are devil, not saying that. Not saying people are demonic for having tattoos, not saying that. But understanding that when a person does this, that person is manifesting an ownership, a claim of ownership on their own body. They're not doing it themselves. It's another influence that's doing it. Whether somebody's just experienced a death in the family and is doing something to honor that loved one. Whether someone just is celebrating sobriety and is doing this to commemorate that and get support. And additionally, whatever the rationale is, it still exists beyond the individual's own self. The individual is not making that decision 100% on the individual's own. To just know about tattoos itself requires somebody else's influence upon an individual. That's just life, where we get things from. So in recognizing that, just very plainly and simply, recognizing that each tattoo, in this parlance that we're utilizing in terms of demons, is a demon's sign of ownership on that person's body. That's what we're offering. That's what we're sharing. That's what we're articulating, so people can have a mindfulness accordingly. It is a sign of ownership on that person's body. When a woman is being turned out, nasty atrocity. But this is the streets. This is facts. The pimp who's turning her out and is forcing or leading her into doing tricks, very often makes her get a tattoo to signify that she belongs to him. It's a chain. It's literally, again, that brand that cattle ranchers put on their cows to let everybody else know that, yo, that cow is mine. Ancient experience of ownership. And that's what demons are doing when people get tattoos. I have 3 hits. I don't have any tattoos. I have 3 hits. And that's what it is. And I'm not saying, I'll get into this personal thing. Okay. Yeah, all right. We'll get into the personal thing. So I'll give some explanation, give some background on this. So first of all, what gives me where I'm getting this, where we get this from, is ancient teachings, from particularly Torah, from the Quran, even from the Buddha, from the Digha Nikaya, and otherwise, from the Bhagavad Gita, about, from Quran and Torah, specifically about not getting tattoos, not marking up the body. Because of that, understanding what's being done when somebody does that to somebody's self. And it's not disrespecting one's ancestors. It's not disrespecting the decisions that have been made beforehand or otherwise. That's not the point. It's not to devalue people. It's not condemn. It's not a matter of saying people are going to hell because of that. No, we're not saying that. But just to understand what's being done when somebody does it to oneself. We know they're beautiful kinfolk, holy kinfolk that are involved in doing this for others, and that are involved in doing it for themselves. So it's not a condemnation or rebuking or anything in that respect. It's just a matter of articulating what is happening when this is done, so that people can be mindful of this. It is a gesture of being owned, plain and simple, Not going into the pimp talk or the rationalizations. It is an ancient symbol and practice and methodology signifying ownership. Plain and simple. Even when one does it oneself, even when one designs it oneself and does everything, even when one puts it on oneself own, it's still something else influencing that person to do that. Regardless of what the immediate conditions are that precipitate it, like I said, grieving or celebrating or signifying a bond or marriage or otherwise, regardless of what that is, there's an influence that is guiding those kinfolk into self-imposing that symbol of ownership to something beyond themselves. And again, not saying it's devil out and out, not saying kinfolk are doomed to hell, not saying any of that. Just articulating it is a signature of ownership from something else. Now, and this is what is taught specifically, directly, explicitly within Torah, similarly within the Quran, effectively and intrinsically within the Bhagavad Gita and the Digha Nikaya. Just again, when we look further into the teachings of the general teachings of attachment, and even just the experience of ownership itself, it is easier to observe and to acknowledge what I just articulated about the nature of tattoos and hits and otherwise being signatures of ownership from being owned by some other entity. So that being said, now I share my personal. This is where the guidance comes from, and that's what precipitates me sharing this, us sharing this at this moment and such. Now, for myself personally, I don't have any tattoos, as I mentioned. When I begin my spiritual path, I abstain from doing any of the such voluntary demarcation of my body. That being said, before I begin my spiritual path, I go through the process of acquiring 3 hits on my body in affiliation with my fraternity. That's what many kinfolk within our fraternity do. Within different fraternities, it's a thing. Getting actual brands. It's not a tattoo. Some people get tattoos, but that's not like the traditional thing. Traditional thing is getting a hit. That means getting a brand, like with cattle, when it's put on the coals and it's heated up, turns red hot, and people burn it onto a cow and that shows that that cow belongs to that cattle rancher. The same thing is done to humans in this fraternity thing. The brand is heated up and then burned on somebody's body. And it effectively is a signature of being owned by the fraternity. But not just the fraternity, but particularly when being a Greek letter fraternity or organization. It's a matter of a signature of being owned by the fraternity as well as the Greek cultural heritage and hierarchy that governs Greek letter organizations. The political ideology and philosophy um, within Greek letter organizations that is very um, connected with and in relationship with precepts and presumptions of democracy, and additionally within Western civilization. So all of this factors into the authoritarian constructs within the fraternity experience. And that's what I experienced at that moment. Wanting to do my part within the organization and further. And so, with other kinfolk from my sands and distant sands, and from different years of crossing, we go through that traditional process of getting hit. And I did it on 3 occasions and with 3 different kinfolk. And that's part of the reason for doing it as well. Strengthening bond, experience of bond with kinfolk who go through the same thing. But in each of those cases, for each of us, again, it is going through a process of being labeled, of being branded as being owned by some other phenomena. And that's part of the difficulty. Because when I go through that process of getting hit 3 times, it reminds me of the actual slave trade of Africans being proclaimed as being owned by other human beings. And it's difficult to reconcile that at the moment of getting hits 30 years ago. And when it seems everybody else is doing it, it's like, well, okay, we'll go with the flow for this one. But that's what I experienced at this moment. I have 3 hits. And again, this is before my spiritual path. So I haven't done anything like that after beginning my spiritual path, after going to the mikvah and otherwise, after making shahada and otherwise. So I haven't gotten any hits or tattoos or anything else like that. So the hits that I have are with me for life. They're burns. It's scars. This is tribal too within Africa. There's cuttings in the face that signify tribal affiliation. That's a sense of ownership, even from ancestors and tribal leadership. And those types of things are also prohibited, specifically within Torah as well, not to cut oneself or to harm or afflict oneself in that way. Because not to acquiesce to those symbols of being owned by some other entity other than God. God doesn't need those markings to signify that type of servitude on the holy divine, how can we say, divine servitude to the divine, to the oneness, the divine one. So anyways, though that's traditional teaching and guidance in that respect, and again, it's not with the intention or suggestion of condemning anyone. It's just a matter of acknowledging what it is, acknowledging it for what it is, and recognizing that this is something I continue to wrestle with. These hits are with me, and so I continue to wrestle with that, of shirking off those symbols of ownership, whilst still walking in this trot. I'm going a little bit rambly at the moment, rambly brambly in his wilderness. Uh, so I'll go further, talking about like the nature of the ownership. So again, in getting a hit, the hit is specific to the Greek letter fraternity that I'm a member of, for life, by the grace of the Most High. So that's the direct affiliation, that's the direct articulation and rationale. However, the actuality is that in acquiescing to an ownership of a Greek letter organization, any of the nine, or however many kinfolk are counting at this moment, any acquiescence to that is acquiescence to the governing structures of the different Greek organizations, whether that's the Panhellenic Council, whether that's some further clandestine or secret cultish society that governs over Greek letter organizations, that Greek letter organizations acquiesce to. Acquiescing to the Greek letter organization involves necessarily, by proxy, acquiescing to those further clandestine agencies. And that's part of the challenge. Because on one hand, to challenge that acquiescence, well, let's do it this way, to proactively proclaim that allegiance and that acquiescence can be accused of being sellout, inauthentic, and otherwise. And to speak against it, to refuse it, can be susceptible to being accused of being betraying, going against one's own self for whatever reason. And be accused of being a betrayer, a Benedict Arnold, for going against the fraternity or sorority, going against the Greek letter organizations and otherwise, knowing how difficult it is. Yet there's always a greater truth. There's a greater purpose. And so we trust in that, and we share that as much as we can, and we emphasize that. And we invite it to speak for itself, and be true to that as much as possible. And being true to that means letting go of the limited, I am falling asleep now. So we're hour into this joint at this moment, and we may leave it at this for the moment. Starting to get into that realm of further details about this experience of affliction and multicultural support for path, and particularly mixed heritage kinfolk on path. We're going to leave it at that. The fatigue factor is setting in, and that's going to affect the articulation at the moment. So recognizing that, rather than just like struggle with that for the next hour or so, let's call it, and work on rejuvenation and returning with greater energy and concentration to conclude this particular joint. at this moment. With all this communicated, we give all thanks and praise to the Most High Elohim, blessed love and peace. In Rastafari, and may peace and blessings be with all beings. Alhamdulillah, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Aloha. Dao Ke, Dao Fei Cheng, Dao Ming Ke, Ming Fei Cheng, Ming Ja Rastafari. Deus nos te aqui, essential santificated nomentum, Vahengusanam. Baruch Ata Elohim, Elohim Melech Hamut Dachim in Red Samay. Kyrie eleison, Sevamas, tu Sabegat He Sabe, Sata, Bafonto Sukidata, Fagavia. Aquaba, Upendo, Naman, if Kyrie eleison. Cine da per me leo magica un budo small fikitka sese come se ni da mo arka da pelo ma yellow wakata to production good and go thank you for the blesses ata jami ya for me but oh shanti me all thanks and praise the Most High Elohim, known by many names. There it is. Blessed love and peace of Rastafari.